Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.39, The Battle of Long Island. Last time, we spent our episode talking about the campaign up in Canada and down in the South in South Carolina. The fighting in Canada had not gone well for the American forces, who had by July been forced out of Canada and now found themselves stuck on Illinois, as smallpox decimated their camp. In the South, it was a different story. The American forces had repelled the British landing on Sullivan's Island and had dealt Henry Clinton a stinging loss before they jumped into a brutal war with the Cherokee. However, from the time that the British had evacuated Boston, George Washington was well aware that Canada and the South were just secondary theaters. Everybody knew that the primary theater of the war in 1776 was going to be in New York. Howe had been loitering off the coast of New York for a while, an ominous sign on the distance of an inevitable battle to come. On July 2nd, the British began their landing on Staten Island. Following his loss in South Carolina, Admiral Richard Howe moved up the coast and was arriving in New York by early July, along with his 2,500 troops. Among those who were now with Howe was a new Ethiopian regiment, which was made up of enslaved men who had managed to get across to British lines. As it was Lord Dunmore who had made his proclamation offering emancipation in consideration of their service. Many of these men were from Virginia. For the next several weeks, troops would continue to pour in, and by the end of August, Howe's army was comprised of some 32,000 men, in addition to another 10,000 sailors. Washington, who with 19,000 troops at his command had less than half of what the British had, spent June preparing New York City for the coming invasion. Looking at the orders of Washington that June, we find a man who was frantically doing everything that he could to fortify the city and to prepare for Howe's men. We are going to spend a good amount of time today discussing his preparations for the defense of New York. However, I want to take a moment to focus on the other struggles that Washington found himself having to deal with in the lead-up to Howe's landing. His writings and correspondence during that June and July tell the story of all those different struggles that he was having to face. New York remained something of a loyalist haven in 1776, a status that it would hold throughout the entire war. It is no accident that the final British evacuation following the end of the Revolution is going to be from New York. In 1776, Washington found himself dealing with issues from people living on Long Island, who seemed less than excited to play along. On June 13th, writing to Nathaniel Woodhull, he shared his concerns regarding Long Island, stating that they were not the most friendly to the cause of the colonies. In his letter, Washington placed his focus on the large number of supplies that existed on Long Island, and the real fear that those supplies could fall into the hands of the British invaders. Washington's major complaint was that Long Islanders refused to take the colonial money. Desperate to ensure those supplies went to the Americans and not the British, he implored Congress to pay for the supplies using hard currency. On June 24th, Washington wrote to Nathanael Greene that he should head out to Nassau and work on disarming the population who seemed ready to act up against the American cause. Days later, on June 28th, he would write to John Hancock expressing similar fears of Long Islanders taking up arms against the United cause. With serious concerns about the state of affairs out on Long Island, from a population that seemed increasingly hostile to the American cause, Washington would also find that not all of those men in his own camp were exactly thrilled with how things were progressing. In his general orders from June 28th, Washington mentions the unhappy fate of Thomas Hickey, who had been executed on that day for mutiny, sedition, and treachery. Washington was not exactly clear in his orders what he meant by mutiny, sedition, and treachery. However, he does make a note that avoiding lewd women was the first step towards avoiding being led down that same path as Thomas Hickey. In that same letter he wrote to John Hancock about the status of things on Long Island, Washington mentions Hickey, where he indicates that he may have been conspiring to aid the British in their arrival. The inclusion in the general orders of the fate of Thomas Hickey was meant, more than anything, to be a warning to the rest of the men of the very serious consequences that came with betraying the cause, especially considering that Washington was well aware that Hickey was not acting alone in his duplicity. At the same time that this was all going on, Washington was dealing with the realization that the mission in Canada was very quickly going sideways. Writing to Israel Putnam on June 3rd, Washington expressed his concerns that the situation in Canada was becoming worse, and letting Putnam know that he had appealed to Congress to send more troops to the north, though he makes clear that he was unwilling to send a regiment from New York, with Howe's arrival seeming imminent. By June 7th, Washington was writing to Philip Schuyler that what he was hearing about the situation in Canada was alarming. It is worth noting, especially because we know that Schuyler is on the verge of being replaced by Horatio Gates, that Washington does seem at least a bit annoyed in this letter that Schuyler wasn't actually present in Canada. By June 23rd, Washington wrote again to John Hancock about the loss at Three Rivers, further indicating that he was very worried about the loss of the entire army in Canada. The next day, Washington was writing to Horatio Gates, letting him know of his promotion and basically laying out that his job was to do whatever he could to save the army. As though all of this was not enough, Washington was plagued by supply problems. On June 26, he told Artemas Ward that he was in the greatest distress for arms, without the most distant prospect of obtaining a supply. Washington ordered Ward to send along 200 additional guns that had been left in Boston when they had relocated to New York. So, let's take a moment to just fully understand the scope of the problems that Washington was dealing with in just June 1776. In Canada, he faced the reality of a mission that was falling apart. Washington really was concerned that the entire Canadian army was going to be destroyed. Back in New York, he was dealing with a supply problem that would plague him for much of the war. There were the citizens on Long Island that were seemingly unwilling to get on board with defending New York, and were indeed ready to do what they could to help the British. And then even within his own ranks, he was dealing with the problem of mutiny and sedition. All of these things and more were consuming the man, and yet we have not even begun to speak of the biggest elephant in the room of all, specifically defending New York from Howe. The situation facing George Washington in June 1776 was clearly a daunting one. New York was always going to pose a serious challenge to the Whig forces. The extensive waterways that wrapped through the area gave the British a real opportunity to flex their very considerable naval might. By the time that Washington had arrived in Boston, the British were hemmed into a corner. They were stuck in Boston without any really great options of a breakout. With the British naval advantage, Washington was well aware that this time it would be the British dictating where the sides would meet. Knowing that ultimately, the British were going to be the ones choosing the time and the place of the battle, immediately upon his arrival, Washington turned to the task of getting defenses in place. These efforts largely revolved around doing what they could to protect the river system around the city. It was a surprise to nobody that the British Navy was going to be the most significant challenge. Washington therefore focused on building forts that would, hopefully, prevent the British entry into those rivers, while at the same time digging in at critical defensive locations all around the city. Despite erecting defensive batteries along the shores, both in New York and New Jersey, they would prove to have far less success than Washington and Company would have liked. On July the 12th, the British decided to give the Americans something of a show of force, in order to remind them of the might of the British Navy. The arriving British ships mostly just sailed right past the American defensive works, seemingly unconcerned about the forts that were firing on them. Among the forts that would be involved in those opening salvos was Fort George, located on the tip of Manhattan, where a 19-year-old Alexander Hamilton would make his debut in the war, as he opened fire on the encroaching British ships. Although there had been some attempts at stopping the British, mostly what Washington was left with on the 12th was a whole lot of anger and disappointment. While the casualties did remain low from the day's events, Washington raged at the number of officers who, instead of conducting themselves like soldiers, had rather stood amazed at the spectacle of the British warships. The day's events had hammered home just how much danger the Americans really were in. Despite this show of force, however, that's all it really was. There would be no massive attack on the 12th, nor would the British try anything dramatic, like trying to take Manhattan. At the end of the day, the outcome was far more about chipping away at the American Army's morale than it was about seizing any tangible benefit. If the British plan had called for Howe to move into the Hudson, while Carleton moved south from Canada, thus cutting New England off entirely, the plan did have a few critical flaws. Among the biggest, and the one that we have already begun to hint at, is that both Carleton and William Howe were cautious men. We already know from Boston that Howe had a serious reluctance towards doing anything that would bring an undue risk to his army. This means that rather than striking a quick and decisive blow upon his arrival, once Howe began to land troops on July 2nd on Staten Island, the long-awaited attack did not immediately come. In fact, it would not come for nearly 2 more months. From the time of his arrival in April, Washington had everybody hard at work on getting the city as ready as possible for the coming landing. By the time that mid-August had rolled around, Washington would write to Congress in frustration that the British were just sitting there, biding their time. A battle was obviously coming. At some point, the British were going to have to start thinking about the winter. However, as of yet, Howe and company were just sitting there, waiting. Now, we know that from earlier today, that Howe would end up with some 32,000 troops on the ground. However, they would not all arrive until the end of August, nearly 2 months after the British would first land at the beginning of July. As it turns out, the always cautious Howe had been instructed by the new colonial secretary, George Germain, to wait for further German mercenaries to arrive. As the British waited for their reinforcements, Washington focused his efforts in 2 primary places. First, he had ordered that his men dig in and build fortifications towards the southern tip of Manhattan, that area around Fort George. It was believed that when the landing came, this would very well be the spot where Howe would choose to make his stand. Across the East River, Washington placed men along Brooklyn Heights, at the far western tip of Long Island. That Washington would find himself concerned with Brooklyn Heights should come as little surprise. Only a few months earlier, it was Washington who saw just how much power control over a single hill could give, provided that it was the right hill. Brooklyn Heights served largely the same role that Dorchester Heights in Boston had served back during the spring. Should the British be able to get a foothold on the Heights and get artillery up there, suddenly the entirety of New York City would find itself in mortal peril. Holding the Heights was critical for Washington if he had any meaningful hope of holding on to New York. Defending these 2 critical points, Manhattan and Brooklyn Heights, meant that, despite already being at a manpower disadvantage, Washington was going to be required to split his army. To defend Brooklyn Heights, Washington had dug in all around the village of Brooklyn. Knowing that Howe was going to have the manpower advantage, though at the same time underestimating just how much of an advantage that William Howe had, Washington chose to spread out over the length of about 3 miles across what was called the Heights of Guan. This was a series of heavily wooded hills that extended off to the east. Washington's right flank ran to the Gowanus Creek, where natural salt marshes provided protection from being outflanked. Defending the heights of Guam gave Washington some key advantages. First, it meant that Howe was going to be forced to spread out his army far more, thus reducing the impact from his manpower advantage. Second, there were only 4 passes in the heights. There was a coastal pass, Flatbush, Bedford, and finally the smaller and seemingly less well-known Jamaica Pass on what was the far American left side of the line. With so few passes over such a long distance, it also cut down on Howe's options, giving the Americans a better chance at predicting where the British were going to end up. Although Howe had previously engaged in some saber-rattling, really that was all. Mostly what Howe and company had done was sat around, causing a mixture of apprehension and occasional confusion for George Washington. The wait would finally come to an end on August 22nd, when huge numbers of troops, British and German alike, began to move from Staten Island to Gravesend on Long Island. In all, some 15,000 troops would make the transfer. Howe's movements here put Washington into an uncomfortable spot. As Washington watched Howe's army move, he ran into a few problems. First, as has become something of a signature move by Howe, even once the 15,000 men had made it onto Long Island, nobody really did anything. They landed and then resumed sitting around ominously. George Washington was left with the question of if this was it. Was this the battle that he had been waiting for? On the other hand, what if this was all a trick, a mere feint? Washington was worried that this entire move was a ruse to get him to relocate his men from Manhattan to Long Island. Howe could then, in theory, use his vastly superior navy to do a speed run around Washington and land on the suddenly unoccupied Manhattan. If Howe could pull that off and Manhattan was undefended, it would leave Washington badly, perhaps catastrophically exposed. Having no navy to provide him the reinforcements that he desperately needed, Washington was forced to keep his army divided between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Though the British would once again spend a few days biding their time, this was not a feint. Howe began moving troops on August the 26th and started towards the heights of Guam. With Washington having to carefully split his army between Brooklyn and Manhattan, he remained reluctant at the idea of moving troops across the East River to help protect Brooklyn. However, on August 24th, so 2 days before Howe began moving towards the heights, Washington made the discovery that he had been operating on bad intelligence. And rather than 8,000 British and Germans preparing for a battle, the actual number was far closer to 16,000. Despite the need to keep Manhattan reinforced, Washington did give in and bring some 3,000 additional troops over into Brooklyn. In the days before the battle, Washington also found himself having to make several key leadership decisions. On the eve of the battle, Washington was in a tight spot as a crisis of leadership suddenly appeared. The defense of Brooklyn Heights had been in the hands of Nathanael Greene, somebody whom Washington trusted implicitly. Unfortunately, Greene had taken ill and needed to be replaced. Here, however, Washington acted with anything but decisiveness. The 2 most senior officers that Washington had to choose from were John Sullivan and Israel Putnam. Originally he, albeit very reluctantly, selected John Sullivan to defend Brooklyn Heights and command the battle. Poor John Sullivan was having a rough go of things. Of course, we know from last time that Sullivan had anything but a good time in Canada, having suffered a serious defeat at Trois Rivieres. Now, however, he was in New York, where, we will see momentarily, his luck is not going to turn around. Giving Sullivan the command was simply a decision that Washington was never comfortable with. Although he did have misgivings about Israel Putnam as well. Following the events from Canada from June, Washington just had no faith in Sullivan. Upon Washington's discovery right before the battle that the British forces were double what he expected, and that he had been operating on poor intelligence. His faith in Sullivan was just completely tanked. Reversing his earlier decision, he gave the command to Putnam, and then moved Sullivan off to command the defense of the left of the line, along the heights of Guam. Sullivan was primarily concerned with the defense of Flatbush and the Bedford Pass. Though, as he was in command of the left side of the American line, it would follow that he had at least nominal command over the defense of Jamaica Pass. William Alexander Sterling was in charge of the far right side of the line, the pass that went along the sea. While Sullivan had taken efforts to reinforce Flatbush and Bedford, there seemed to be very little attention paid to the far left of the line and to the Jamaica Pass. Now, the Jamaica Pass was not exactly a great pass through the heights. The pass was narrow and did not lend itself to large armies marching through it. Plus, having a smaller pass meant that fewer numbers of men could defend it. This meant that for any army attempting to use the pass, they were faced with a natural choke point. However, right up until the very last minute, Jamaica Pass did not even seem to be an afterthought. If anything, it seemed to have been completely forgotten about. It was only at the last minute that Sullivan decided to stick a few guys over there to guard an otherwise exposed path. And to be completely clear, by a few guys, I mean 5 guys. Literally, 5 guys. Now, in full disclosure, I spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out exactly why Jamaica Pass was left almost completely undefended. The answer that I most often came across was the completely unsatisfying answer that Jamaica Pass seemed to have just been overlooked in its importance. It was easily the smallest of the 4 passes, and it appears to have not been as well known as the other 3. Out of Washington, Sullivan, Putnam, or Greene, none of them were from New York. Sure, there was a small force assigned to it at the end, but it is entirely possible, judging from the fact that there were literally 5 guys stuck there, that everybody in charge overlooked the pass and the very significant danger that it could pose to the left side of the American line. Other contributing factors in the confusion may have come from a result of Washington's own vacillations in leadership in the days before the battle. Regardless of the reasons, though, we know that Jamaica Pass was either overlooked or ignored. Although the reasons why Jamaica Pass was so undermanned can be left up to debate, there is no question that the pass was left all but completely undefended. Henry Clinton would be the first one to discover this very serious weakness in the American defenses when he approached the pass in the very early hours of August 27th. When Clinton's army reached Jamaica Pass, the 5 men sent to hold it quickly melted away, allowing the British to pour through unopposed. It is suggested by Woody Holton that the British might have been clued into the undefended pass by local loyalists. Based on discussions earlier in the episode today, this seems to fall into line with what we already know. Washington did not trust the Long Islanders, and he had been dealing with problems from recalcitrant colonists for months. It is hardly unthinkable to believe that they would now pass along information on this lesser-known pass, and the defensive efforts of the Americans to the British. Regardless of why it was so badly protected or why this is the place that the British chose to move, British troops just poured onto the other side of the heights of Guam. As the British flowed without any resistance through Jamaica Pass, elsewhere along the line, the British began engaging the defending Americans, who were still seemingly unaware of the large army sliding into place behind their position. As the sun came up on the morning of the 27th, the British opened up with cannon fire all along the heights of Guam. As the British now moved through Jamaica Pass, trying to be as quiet as possible, despite having to spend a considerable amount of effort moving through the heavily wooded area, our old friend, James Grant, got everybody's attention. when he opened up fire all along the right side of the American line near the coast. Now, if you don't remember James Grant, we have actually met with him twice now. Earlier this season, we saw him in the Cherokee War. And before that, it was Grant who very nearly blew up the Eastern Conference back during the French and Indian War, when he made a very ill-advised attempt on Fort Duquesne. As Grant attacked at the Gowanus Pass on the right side, German troops attacked Sullivan at both Bedford and Flatbush, effectively pinning his men into place. The stark reality of the situation really struck home at around 9 a.m., however, when those troops that had come through the Jamaica Pass arrived at Bedford Village, behind the Heights of Guam, and therefore behind the American position. Now the Americans found themselves being attacked from the front, from the left, and now from behind. With the attack coming from three directions, Sullivan's position crumbled. Over on the right side of the line, Sterling's men would continue to fight for hours. But realistically, it was all over. Sterling was at very serious risk of being surrounded. Seeing the writing on the wall, he ordered his men back across those difficult salt marshes towards Brooklyn. Sterling and a contingent of Maryland troops remained behind, fighting bravely to provide cover to the retreating men. By midday, with Cornwallis closing in on his position, Sterling, along with many of his men who had survived this long, were captured. The Battle of Long Island was at an end just a few hours after it started. The American line along the Heights of Guam had been completely overwhelmed by the British, as the Americans were forced into a precarious position in Brooklyn. John Sullivan, who was just having a really rough summer, was captured during the battle. As the smoke cleared, the Americans had to look around at nearly 200 dead, with another 900 captured. The combined British and German forces had suffered around 60 killed in the battle. With the Heights of Guam now controlled by the British, Washington's army had little time to sit back and lick its wounds. The real prize was always Brooklyn Heights, which at least for the moment was still in his control. Yet with the British victory, that position on the Heights was tenuous at best, and downright untenable at worst. Now, at least initially, Washington had hoped to hold on to his position on Brooklyn Heights. It had good defenses, and the army, although a bit bloodied up from the loss, was still intact. Plus, should the British get control over Brooklyn, it would seriously expose the rest of New York. Washington in many ways got lucky here. First, despite having the American army up against the ropes and really on the run, Howe did not pursue them immediately into Brooklyn for a direct assault. We circle back here to the fact that Howe just did not like taking unnecessary risks with his army. He was a long way from home and knew that every soldier he lost was going to be difficult to replace. Instead, Howe settled on a siege. Now, this was not going to necessarily be a traditional siege, but it would work much the same. Howe could dig in and blast away at the American position, while Admiral Richard Howe swung the Navy around and blocked any American escape efforts. The Americans did not have any kind of a navy to challenge Howe, so it is not as though they had much hope for relief. Though Howe could have acted more dramatically by immediately sending his army up towards Brooklyn Heights, he was not terribly interested in a repeat of Bunker Hill, which may well have been the price that he would have been required to pay. For the American army on Long Island, this was an absolute catastrophe. Sure, Howe did not rush the position and slaughter them all, but they were terribly exposed. If the British Navy got into position behind them, it was just going to be a matter of time. A siege might take a little bit longer, but Howe was going to be able to effect the same end without nearly as much risk to his own army. As though the situation was not bad enough already. In this instance, George Washington was really not helping things. Washington was desperate to hold Brooklyn Heights because it was so critical to the defense of New York itself. Washington, as we are going to see, had something of a preoccupation with New York. He always viewed it as being that key linchpin of the entire war, even when events suggested that it wasn't. However, now, with his army at very real risk of being surrounded and cut off in Brooklyn, Washington made the questionable decision to move more troops across the East River to reinforce the heights. As the commander of the American army, Washington would join his men in Brooklyn. Months before in Boston, it was William Howe who was preparing for what was likely going to amount to a suicidal attack on the Americans' position on the Dorchester Heights. What had saved Howe that day was a rainstorm. As the rain pelted down, he was able to take a deep breath, allow that initial shock and emotional fatigue to wear off, and realize what a bad idea storming Dorchester Heights really was. He called off the attack, abandoned Boston, and, most importantly, lived to fight another day. Now, on August the 28th, as Washington was making plans for an impossible defense over a position that he probably could never hold, it began to rain. Really, it began to pour. The sudden storm momentarily stalled British efforts to begin blasting away. Everybody was just hunkering down, trying to stay as dry and as warm as possible. Most importantly is that the storm had brought with it a cold, gusting northern wind. This wind prevented Admiral Howe from moving his navy into the East River and cutting off the American escape. As the storm raged on, Washington met with his generals. His generals were able to convince Washington that defending Brooklyn was a fool's errand, and that the position was not sustainable. They were able to convince him that it needed to be abandoned. Washington reluctantly concurred, and that night evacuated back across the East River into Manhattan. The evacuation was truly a masterful performance by Washington. Everything remained orderly and silent. The British had no idea that the Americans were escaping. The men had been ordered not to speak or cough, while Israel Putnam and some Indian allies went off and made as much noise as they possibly could to cover the sound. Thomas Mifflin remained in position to give cover to the retreating men, also taking pains to be as noisy as possible. Over the course of some 8 hours, Washington successfully moved 12,000 American troops off of Long Island. The Battle of Long Island was bad for the Americans. However, it was not the near-complete catastrophe that it really could have been. The Americans made critical errors in their preparations for the battle. The left side of their line was completely undefended, and the British were able to outflank them without any resistance. 2 major generals in Sullivan and Sterling had been captured. The Americans had suffered over 1,000 casualties between those killed and captured. There is no way that this can be spun as a victory because it wasn't. The British had very convincingly won the day. Washington threw blame around, mostly focused towards the militia companies who he felt had broken and fled far too easily. And although there is some truth to this, Washington proved far more hesitant to criticize the failures of both himself and his officers. While he did call out Sullivan for failing to secure the left flank, that was really as far as he would go. Historian Woody Holton explains in his book, Liberty is Sweet, that Washington may have placed an unfair amount of blame upon the militia in order to achieve a political victory. Washington had long been pushing for a professional army with enlistments that lasted more than a single year. Having an army that was always at risk of being completely dissolved was no way to win a war. By throwing the blame towards those untrained soldiers, Washington might have been trying to push the need for a professional army. Regardless of if this was indeed his intention, on September 16th, Congress did exactly that, requiring that new recruits agree to serve for a minimum of 3 years, but ideally for the remainder of the war, while at the same time making promises of land and sign-up bonuses. Despite these new promises of a more professional army, nothing would come quickly. Congress left the actual job of recruiting troops to the individual states. As it would turn out, the states responded with that same sense of urgency that we had seen them respond with back during the French and Indian War, which is to say, at a snail's pace. This lack of urgency left Washington in a desperate situation, as his army constantly threatened to evaporate. More immediately, the Battle of Long Island could have proven to be an unmitigated disaster. Had that storm not rolled in and given Washington a chance to reconsider his position, it is possible that for those Americans in Brooklyn, including Washington himself, it could have proven to be a fatal blow. We don't know if the Americans could have survived the loss of a 12,000-man army, the accompanying officer corps, and potentially even Washington. However, I think that we can say with a relatively high amount of confidence that it certainly does not bode well. The evacuation likewise had been flawlessly executed with everybody remaining disciplined. The British were none the wiser to the American withdrawal, and Howe found himself stunned when he saw that his prize had slipped across the East River to fight another day. Although they suffered a loss, the Americans had survived the Battle of Long Island. The army was not destroyed. It remained intact and in the field. The war would continue on with the lessons of Long Island having been learned. Next time, we will remain in New York as General Howe prepares for his landing on Manhattan itself, while Washington and the Americans try to find some way to hold the city. Until then, I hope you all have a fantastic 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we return to New York.